The thunder of approaching horses echoed across the dusty plains of Blackwater Creek, Arizona, as Abigail Jennings pressed her body against the rough bark of an old oak tree. The year was 1878, and the woman who had once lived comfortably in Boston now found herself fleeing for her life, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild mustang trying to break free. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down her neck as she clutched the leather satchel containing everything she had left in the world: a few dollars, a tarnished locket, and the deed to land that men were willing to kill for. "There she is!" a gruff voice shouted, and Abigail's blood ran cold. Three riders emerged from behind the ridge, their horses kicking up clouds of red dust as they closed in on her position. These were Harlan Wade's men, the same brutes who'd burned down her father's homestead just days after his funeral, claiming the land now belonged to their employer. Their leader, a man with a pockmarked face and dead eyes, drew his pistol. Abigail ran, her boots slipping on loose stones as she scrambled down the embankment toward the creek. A bullet whizzed past her ear, close enough that she felt its heat against her skin. Her lungs burned with each desperate breath, and her legs trembled with exhaustion. She had been running for days, sleeping in abandoned barns and surviving on whatever she could forage. The sound of rushing water grew louder as she approached the creek, but when she reached the bank, her heart sank. What was typically a shallow crossing had swelled to a raging torrent from the recent rains. There was no way across, and the riders were closing in fast. "End of the line, Miss Jennings," the pockmarked man called out. "Wade wants that deed, and we aim to get it." Abigail turned to face her pursuers, her chin lifted in defiance despite the fear coursing through her veins. She had promised her dying father she would protect their land, the land that had been in their family for generations, where he was now buried alongside her mother. She would not surrender it to a man like Harlan Wade, a cattle baron who crushed anyone who stood in his way. "You'll have to kill me first," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The man's lips curled into an ugly smile. "That can be arranged." He raised his pistol, and in that moment, Abigail knew she was going to die. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she fell to her knees in the dust, her blue dress billowing around her like a pool of water. She closed her eyes, waiting for the bullet that would end her life. Instead, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the creek, and the pockmarked man howled in pain as his pistol flew from his hand. Two more shots followed in quick succession, sending the other riders diving for cover. "Get down!" a deep voice commanded, and Abigail flattened herself against the ground as bullets whizzed overhead. Through the chaos, she glimpsed a tall figure on horseback charging down from the opposite ridge, firing with deadly accuracy. Wade's men returned fire, but they were exposed on open ground, and their aim was hurried and imprecise. Within moments, they were retreating, dragging their wounded leader with them. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Abigail remained on her knees, her body trembling with shock and relief. The stranger dismounted his horse and crossed the shallow part of the creek, water splashing around his boots. She looked up to see a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hair curled beneath a well-worn Stetson, and a star-shaped badge gleamed on his leather vest. He knelt before her, strong hands gently gripping her shoulders. "You all right, madam?" he asked, his voice as rich as aged whiskey. Abigail tried to speak, but no words came. The events of the past week, her father's death, the fire, the relentless pursuit crashed over her like a wave. Tears spilled down her dust-streaked cheeks, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The stranger's expression softened. He reached down and, with surprising gentleness, lifted her to her feet. His hands were calloused but warm against her skin. "You'll never kneel again," he said firmly. "Not to men like that. Not while I draw breath." Abigail looked into the stranger's eyes and saw not pity, but a fierce determination that steadied her more than any words of comfort could have. "I'm Xavier Ironwood," he said, releasing her but remaining close. "Marshal of Silver Ridge, though I'm a fair piece from home at the moment." "Abigail Jennings," she replied, her voice hoarse. "My father's homestead." "I know," Xavier interrupted, his expression darkening. "News travels fast, even out here. Harlan Wade's been trying to consolidate the whole valley. When I heard about what happened to your pa, I figured his men would be coming after you next." "How did you find me?" Xavier's lips quirked into a half smile. "Wasn't hard to follow the trail of a Boston lady on the run. No offense, madam, but you leave tracks a blind man could follow." Despite everything, Abigail found herself smiling back. "I suppose tracking isn't part of a proper lady's education." "No, I reckon it ain't." Xavier glanced toward the ridge where Wade's men had disappeared. "They'll be back, and with more men. We need to move." He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. Abigail stiffened at the proximity. She'd never been this close to a man who wasn't kin, and despite her exhaustion, she was acutely aware of his chest pressed against her back, his arms around her as he took the reins. "Where are we going?" she asked as they forded the creek. "I've got a cabin about 10 miles from here. It's not much, but it's defensible. We'll rest there tonight, then figure out our next move." Xavier paused, then added, "If that's all right with you, Miss Jennings." Abigail thought of the alternatives: continuing to run alone or returning to the charred remains of her home, and nodded. "Yes, that would be appreciated, Marshal Ironwood." "Xavier," he corrected. "Out here, formality is a luxury most can't afford." "Then you must call me Abigail," she replied, relaxing slightly against him as the horse carried them away from the creek. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fallen. The small structure nestled against the base of a rocky outcrop, surrounded by juniper trees and sagebrush. Inside, it was spare but clean, with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with provisions. Xavier built a fire while Abigail sat at the table, watching the flames cast dancing shadows across the walls. The events of the day had left her hollow with exhaustion, but her mind refused to quiet. "You should eat something," Xavier said, placing a plate of beans and dried beef in front of her. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." "I haven't," Abigail admitted, suddenly aware of the gnawing hunger in her stomach. She ate quickly, the simple food tasting better than any feast she'd had in Boston. "How long have you been running?" Xavier asked, settling across from her with his own plate. "4 days. After the fire, I hid in the root cellar until they left. Then I took what I could carry and ran." Abigail's hand went to the satchel still slung across her body. "They want the deed to our land. My father refused to sell to Wade, even when he offered good money." Xavier nodded. "Your pa was right to refuse. Wade doesn't offer fair deals. He pays a pittance, then runs the sellers off before they can cash his check." "You know a lot about Harlan Wade." "Been tracking his operation for months," Xavier replied, his jaw tightening. "He's been buying up homesteads all across the territory, by hook or by crook. Some folks sell willingly, others are persuaded by his methods of intimidation. A few, like your father, refuse outright." "And end up dead," Abigail whispered. Xavier met her gaze across the table. "I aim to see that doesn't happen to you." After dinner, Xavier insisted Abigail take the bed while he slept by the fire. Too exhausted to protest, she removed her boots and lay down fully clothed, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her as she stared at the ceiling, listening to the crackling fire and the soft sounds of Xavier moving about the cabin. "Marshal Xavier," she called softly. He appeared beside the bed, his tall frame silhouetted against the firelight. "What is it?" "Thank you," she said simply, "for saving my life." In the dim light, she saw his expression soften. "Get some rest, Abigail. Tomorrow's gonna be a long day. When Abigail woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's small windows. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, then remembered the events of the previous day. The cabin was empty, but a cup of coffee and a plate of Johnny cakes sat on the table. Through the window, she could see Xavier chopping wood, his shirt discarded in the morning heat. Abigail felt her cheeks flush as she watched the play of muscles across his back and shoulders. She had never seen a man's bare torso before, and she knew she should look away, but found herself transfixed. In Boston, the men she'd known had been soft-handed businessmen who never broke a sweat. Xavier Ironwood was something entirely different, a man forged by the harsh realities of the frontier. She quickly moved away from the window when he set down the axe and turned toward the cabin. By the time he entered, she was seated at the table, sipping the coffee he'd left for her. "Morning," he said, pulling his shirt back on. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in a while," Abigail admitted. "Thank you for breakfast." Xavier nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "We need to talk about what happens next." "I'm not selling my land," Abigail said firmly. "My father loved that place. He's buried there, along with my mother. I won't dishonor their memory by giving it to the man who killed him." "I admire your courage, but Wade won't stop coming after you," Xavier said, his expression grave. "He's got half the county in his pocket, including the sheriff in Blackwater." "Then what do you suggest?" Xavier sat across from her, his gray eyes intense. "We need to gather evidence of Wade's crimes, enough to take to the territorial governor. I've been building a case against him for months, but it's not enough yet. With your testimony about what happened to your father, and the deed as proof of his land grab, we might finally be able to bring him down." "You want me to go against Harlan Wade?" Abigail asked, her stomach clenching with fear. "He's one of the most powerful men in the territory." "I know it's asking a lot," Xavier admitted, "but you're already his target. At least this way, we fight back instead of just running." Abigail thought of her father, his weathered face, his calloused hands, the way he'd laughed even when times were hard. He had never backed down from a challenge, had taught her that some things were worth fighting for, even at great cost. "What would we have to do?" she asked finally. Relief flickered across Xavier's face. "I've got a lead on a man who used to work for Wade fellow named Curtis, who helped with some of the shadier business. Word is he's hiding out in a mining camp about 2 days' ride from here. If we can find him, convince him to talk. And if we can't?" Xavier's expression hardened. "Then we keep looking for another way. I won't let Wade win. Not after everything he's done." There was something in his voice, a personal edge that went beyond professional duty. "This isn't just about upholding the law for you, is it?" Abigail asked quietly. Xavier was silent for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Wade's men killed my brother 3 years ago," he finally said. "Thomas was a homesteader, like your pa. He refused to sell his place, even when Wade offered 3 times what it was worth." "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Xavier looked down at her fingers resting on his, then met her gaze. "We both have our reasons to see Wade pay for what he's done." They set out after breakfast, Xavier on his horse with Abigail riding behind him. The day was clear but windy, the landscape a tapestry of red rock, yellow grass, and blue sky that stretched to infinity. Despite the circumstances, Abigail found herself marveling at the wild beauty around her. She had been in Arizona territory for over a year, but her father's homestead had been in a fertile valley, nothing like this vast, rugged terrain. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Xavier said, as if reading her thoughts. "First time I saw the desert, I couldn't understand how anything could live out here. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." "It's so different from Boston," Abigail replied. "Everything there is contained, controlled. Out here, it's boundless. That's why men like Wade want to own it. Xavier said grimly. They can't stand that something so magnificent exists beyond their control. They rode for hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and eat a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack. By late afternoon, Xavier led them off the main trail and up into a narrow canyon where a small stream trickled between rock walls. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, helping Abigail dismount. "Water for the horse, and the canyon walls will hide our fire." Abigail's body ached from the long ride, and her dress was stiff with dust and sweat. While Xavier unsaddled the horse, she walked to the stream, kneeling beside it to splash cool water on her face and neck. "There's a pool just around that bend," Xavier called, nodding toward a curve in the canyon. "Deep enough to bathe in, if you've a mind to. I'll stay with the camp." Grateful for his consideration, Abigail gathered her satchel and made her way to the pool. The water was cold but refreshing as she stripped down to her chemise and stockings, too modest to bathe completely nude, even with Xavier out of sight. She washed as best she could, then changed into her spare dress, the only other clothing she'd managed to salvage from the homestead. When she returned to camp, Xavier had built a small fire and was preparing a rabbit he'd shot along the way. He glanced up as she approached, and something in his expression made her heart skip a beat. "Feel better?" he asked, his voice slightly rough. "Much," Abigail replied, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. She sat across from him, watching as he spitted the rabbit over the fire. "You seem very capable out here." Xavier smiled. "Had to be. My pa was a trapper, took us all over the territory before he passed. By the time I was 12, I could track, hunt, and live off the land better than most grown men." "And how did you become a marshal?" "After Thomas was killed, I wanted justice," Xavier said, turning the rabbit to cook evenly. "Figured the best way to get it was from inside the law. Turned out I had a knack for tracking down criminals." "And a determination to see justice done," Abigail observed. Xavier met her eyes across the fire. "Some things are worth fighting for." They ate in comfortable silence as darkness fell around them. After dinner, Xavier showed her how to remove the last meat from the bones, waste being something the frontier couldn't afford. "Where did you learn to shoot like you did yesterday?" Abigail asked as they sat side by side against a boulder, looking up at stars that seemed close enough to touch. "Army," Xavier replied. "Served as a scout during the Apache campaigns. Learned from some of the best marksmen in the territory." He paused, then added, "Also learned that there's more than one way to see the world. The Apache have as much right to this land as any of us." "My father felt the same," Abigail said softly. "He always treated the native people with respect, traded fairly with them. He said they understood the land in ways we never would." Xavier looked at her with new appreciation. "Your pa sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Abigail agreed, tears pricking her eyes. "I miss him terribly." Without a word, Xavier put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. The simple gesture of comfort broke something inside her, and Abigail found herself weeping openly for the first time since her father's death. Xavier held her while she cried, his hand stroking her hair, offering silent strength. When her tears finally subsided, Abigail became acutely aware of their closeness, of the warmth of his body against hers. She should move away. It wasn't proper, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize for grieving," Xavier interrupted gently. "It's not weakness to mourn those we've lost." Abigail looked up at him, surprised by the understanding in his eyes. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of shared pain, of mutual respect that transcended their brief acquaintance. The next day dawned clear and hot. They broke camp early, eager to reach the mining camp before nightfall. As they rode, Abigail found herself growing more comfortable with Xavier's proximity, even leaning back against his chest when fatigue set in. "Tell me about Boston," Xavier said as they crossed a vast plateau dotted with sagebrush. What was your life like there? Abigail considered the question. Structured. Every day had its routine lessons in the morning, social calls in the afternoon, perhaps a musical evening or a dance. My father was a professor of natural history at Harvard, so our home was always full of books and specimens and visiting academics. Sounds confining, Xavier observed. It was, in many ways, Abigail admitted. That's why I was so eager to come west with my father after my mother died. He inherited this land from his brother but had never seen it. When he decided to make a new start here, I insisted on coming along. No suitors left behind? Xavier asked, then quickly added, Forgive me, that's not my business. Abigail smiled at his discomfort. There were a few young men who expressed interest, but none who saw me as more than a suitable match. They wanted a proper Boston wife who would keep their home and raise their children and never question their decisions. And that's not who you are, Xavier stated rather than asked. No, Abigail said firmly. My father raised me to think for myself, to question everything. He said a curious mind was the greatest gift God gave us, and it was a sin to waste it. Xavier chuckled. I think I would have liked your pa. He would have liked you too, Abigail replied, surprised to realize it was true. Despite their different backgrounds, her father would have appreciated Xavier's straightforward nature and sense of justice. By mid-afternoon, the terrain grew more rugged as they approached the foothills of a mountain range. Xavier grew more alert, scanning their surroundings with watchful eyes. What is it? Abigail asked, sensing his tension. Not sure, he murmured. Just a feeling. We're getting close to the mining camp, but something doesn't feel right. They continued for another mile before Xavier abruptly pulled the horse to a stop. He dismounted, helping Abigail down before leading the horse behind a large boulder. Stay here, he instructed, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. I'm going to scout ahead. Abigail watched anxiously as he moved silently up the rocky slope, disappearing among the boulders. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited, jumping at every sound, the call of a hawk, the rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation, the distant rumble of thunder. When Xavier finally returned, his expression was grim. The camp's been hit, he reported. Looks like Wade's men got there before us. What about Curtis, the man you were looking for? Xavier shook his head. No way to know without getting closer. But if he was there... We have to check, Abigail insisted. He might still be alive, might need help. Xavier studied her face, then nodded slowly. We'll approach from the west side, where there's more cover. But at the first sign of trouble, we pull back. Agreed? Agreed, Abigail said, though the thought of turning away from someone who might need help went against everything she believed. They left the horse secured behind the boulder and proceeded on foot, Xavier leading the way with his rifle ready. As they crested a ridge, Abigail got her first view of the mining camp, a cluster of rough wooden structures nestled in a narrow valley. Even from a distance, she could see that something was terribly wrong. Several buildings were still smoldering, and bodies lay sprawled in the dusty street. My God, she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Xavier's jaw tightened. Stay low and follow me. They made their way down into the valley, moving from cover to cover. The camp was eerily silent except for the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze and the occasional collapse of burned timber. As they reached the edge of the settlement, the full extent of the massacre became clear. At least a dozen men lay dead, most shot, a few bearing marks of more brutal deaths. Wade's men, Xavier muttered, kneeling beside one of the bodies. This is their style, make an example to discourage others from crossing them. How do you know they were looking for Curtis? Abigail asked, trying not to look at the bodies. I don't, for certain, Xavier admitted. But the timing's too convenient. Someone must have tipped them off that we were asking questions. A weak groan from one of the buildings drew their attention. Xavier motioned for Abigail to stay back as he approached a partially collapsed structure that might once have been a saloon. She ignored his warning, following close behind as he pushed through the broken doorway. Inside, a man lay pinned beneath a fallen beam, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes flickered open as they approached, focusing on Xavier's badge. "Marshal," he wheezed. "Knew you'd come. Eventually." Xavier knelt beside the man. "Curtis?" The man managed a feeble nod. "Wade's men, looking for me. Said I'd been talking to the law." "Were you?" Xavier asked. Curtis coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Wanted to. That's why I sent word. Wade's gone too far. Killing women and children now." Abigail knelt on Curtis's other side, taking his hand. "We're going to help you," she promised, though she could see from the extent of his injuries that there was little they could do. Curtis's eyes fixed on her face. "You're the Jennings girl," he said, surprising her. "Your pa, brave man. Wouldn't be intimidated." "You knew my father?" Abigail asked. "Was there, when Wade ordered the hit," Curtis admitted, his voice growing weaker. "Didn't know they'd burn the place, with him inside. That's when I knew. Had to stop." Xavier leaned closer. "Curtis, we need evidence against Wade. Something solid we can take to the governor." Curtis fumbled weakly at his shirt pocket. Inside, ledger. Kept records of everything. Names, dates, payments for killings. Xavier carefully extracted a small leather-bound book from the man's pocket. He flipped through it, his expression hardening as he scanned the contents. "This is it," he said quietly. Names of everyone Wade's had killed, who did it, how much they were paid. Even has the names of officials he's bribed. Curtis's grip on Abigail's hand tightened. "Make him pay," he whispered. "For all of them." "We will," Abigail promised, tears streaming down her face for this dying stranger who had finally found his conscience too late. Curtis's eyes closed and his breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. Abigail gently laid his hand on his chest, saying a silent prayer for his soul. "We need to go," Xavier said, tucking the ledger securely inside his vest. "Wade's men might come back to make sure the job's finished." They had just stepped back outside when the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the valley. Xavier shoved Abigail aside as dirt kicked up where she had been standing. "Run!" he shouted, pushing her toward the nearest cover, a water trough beside the livery stable. 3 more shots rang out as they dove behind the trough. Xavier returned fire, aiming at the ridge where the shots had originated. "How many?" Abigail asked, her heart pounding. "At least 2 shooters," Xavier replied, ducking as another bullet splintered the wood above their heads. "Maybe more." "What do we do?" Xavier checked his ammunition. "We're pinned down. They've got the high ground and better cover. We need a diversion." Abigail peered around the edge of the trough, trying to spot their attackers. A flash of movement caught her eye, a rider moving along the ridgeline, positioning himself to cut off their escape route back to their horse. "They're trying to surround us," she reported. Xavier nodded grimly. "I was afraid of that. Listen, Abigail, I'm going to draw their fire. When I do, you run for that gully to the east, follow it up to the ridge, then circle back to where we left the horse." "What about you?" Abigail demanded, her voice rising with fear. "I'll be right behind you," Xavier assured her, though his eyes told a different story. "The ledger's what matters. You need to get it to Silver Ridge, to Judge Harmon. He's one of the few honest men left in these parts." "I'm not leaving you," Abigail insisted. Before Xavier could argue, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. More of Wade's men were coming up from the south, at least 5 riders moving fast. "We're out of options," Xavier muttered, frustration evident in his voice. Abigail looked around desperately, searching for anything that might help them. Her gaze fell on a barrel beside the livery entrance. The stencil on its side read, "Blasting Powder." "Xavier," she said urgently, pointing. "Could that create enough of a diversion?" He followed her gaze, and a slow smile spread across his face. "It just might, but we'd need something to ignite it from a distance." Abigail thought for a moment, then reached for the small whiskey flask in Xavier's pocket that she'd seen him drink from the night before. "Does this still have alcohol in it?" "A little," Xavier confirmed. "What are you thinking?" "My father taught me about chemical reactions," Abigail explained, tearing a strip from the hem of her petticoat. "If we soak this cloth in the whiskey, stuff it in the top, light it, and roll the barrel toward the riders." "It could work," Xavier said, admiration clear in his eyes. "But it's dangerous. If the fuse burns too quickly—" "We don't have a choice," Abigail interrupted, "and we don't have much time." Working quickly, they prepared the makeshift bomb. Xavier soaked the cloth in whiskey, stuffed it into the barrel's bunghole, and prepared to light it with a match. "When I light this, we'll have seconds to get clear," he warned. "The barrel will roll downhill toward those riders, but the explosion will draw fire from the men on the ridge too. We'll need to run immediately, heading for that gully you spotted." Abigail nodded, her mouth dry with fear. "I'm ready." Xavier struck the match, lit the cloth, and gave the barrel a hard shove. It rolled away from them, picking up speed as it headed toward the approaching riders. Xavier grabbed Abigail's hand, and they ran, zigzagging toward the gully as bullets kicked up dust around them. The explosion came sooner than expected, a deafening boom followed by screams and the terrified whinnying of horses. The force of it knocked Abigail off her feet, sending her sprawling in the dirt. Xavier pulled her up, practically carrying her as they scrambled into the gully just as more gunfire erupted behind them. "Keep going," Xavier urged, pushing her ahead of him as they scrambled up the steep incline. Abigail's lungs burned and her legs trembled with exhaustion, but fear drove her forward. Behind them, the chaos from the explosion was still unfolding, men shouting, horses screaming in pain or fear. As they reached the top of the ridge, Xavier pulled her down behind a large boulder. "Wait," he whispered, peering back toward the mining camp. The scene below was one of devastation. The barrel had apparently contained more blasting powder than they'd realized. The explosion had created a large crater in the center of the camp's main street, and several of the riders had been caught in the blast. The survivors were disorganized, shouting contradictory orders and firing wildly at shadows. "Now's our chance," Xavier said. "While they're scattered, we need to make it back to the horse and put as much distance between us and this place as possible." They moved quickly along the ridgeline, keeping low to avoid being spotted. As they approached the area where they'd left their horse, Xavier suddenly went still, signaling for Abigail to stop. "What is it?" she whispered. "Someone's been here," Xavier replied quietly, pointing to fresh tracks in the dirt. "Recently." Drawing his pistol, he moved cautiously forward. The horse was still where they'd left it, but something was wrong. The animal seemed nervous, shifting from foot to foot, its ears flicking back and forth. Xavier scanned the surrounding area, his body tense. "Show yourself," he called out. "I know you're there." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from behind a cluster of rocks, a man emerged with his hands raised. He was older, with graying hair and a weathered face, wearing the simple clothes of a prospector. "Don't shoot, Marshal," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not with Wade's bunch." "Who are you, then?" Xavier demanded, keeping his pistol trained on the man. "Name's Peterson. I was part of the mining camp back there. Left yesterday to check some claims up in the hills. When I came back and saw what happened..." The man shook his head, his expression grim. "I was hiding, trying to figure out what to do, when I saw you two arrive. Then, when Wade's men showed up, I thought I'd come back here." Figured you might need your horse if you managed to get away. Xavier studied the man, clearly weighing whether to trust him. You know Curtis? He asked finally. Peterson nodded. Good man. Deep down. Got mixed up with Wade because he needed the money, but he's been trying to make it right. His expression fell. Is he dead? Xavier confirmed. But he gave us what we needed before he went. Evidence against Wade, names, dates, payments. Enough to bring him down for good. Relief crossed Peterson's face. Then Curtis did right in the end. That's something, at least. We need to get moving, Abigail urged, glancing nervously back toward the mining camp. They'll regroup soon. Xavier nodded, turning to Peterson. You coming with us? It's not safe for you here if any of Wade's men survive that blast. The older man considered this. Where are you headed? Silver Ridge, Xavier replied. About 2 days' ride from here. We need to get this evidence to Judge Harmon. I know a shortcut, Peterson offered. Through Apache Pass. Cuts nearly half a day off the journey. I've got a mule tied up just over that rise. Xavier looked at Abigail, silently asking her opinion. She studied Peterson's face and saw nothing but honest concern there. I think we should trust him, she said quietly. Xavier holstered his pistol. Lead the way, then. But I'll be watching. They rode hard for the remainder of the day, Peterson on his mule leading them through narrow canyons and across dry creek beds that Xavier admitted he wouldn't have found on his own. By nightfall, they had covered more ground than Xavier had thought possible, but they were all exhausted. We need to rest, Xavier finally said, as darkness made further travel dangerous. Just for a few hours. They made camp in a small box canyon that offered protection on 3 sides. Peterson shared the meager supplies he'd grabbed before fleeing the mining camp, and they ate a cold supper, too wary of pursuers to risk a fire. As they prepared to sleep, Xavier pulled Abigail aside. I'll take the first watch, he said. Peterson seems genuine, but I'm not taking any chances. I trust your judgment, Abigail replied. She hesitated, then added, What you did today, with the barrel, that was incredibly brave. Xavier smiled, the moonlight silvering his features. Me? You're the one who came up with the plan. Where did a Boston lady learn about explosives? My father believed women should understand science as well as men, Abigail explained. He taught me chemistry, geology, botany, anything he thought might be useful. I doubt he imagined I'd use that knowledge to blow up a mining camp, though. Xavier chuckled. I reckon not. You're full of surprises, Abigail Jennings. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Abigail felt herself drawn toward him, a pull as natural as gravity. Xavier reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. You should get some rest, he said softly. Tomorrow will be another long day. Abigail nodded, reluctantly moving away to find a spot to sleep. Despite her exhaustion, she lay awake for some time, watching Xavier's silhouette as he kept watch, wondering at the strange turns her life had taken and the unexpected feelings growing within her heart. They reached Silver Ridge by midday the following day, pushing their mounts hard across the final stretch of desert. The town was larger than Abigail had expected, a proper settlement with wooden sidewalks, a church steeple visible above the other buildings, and a brick courthouse at the far end of the main street. As they rode in, people stopped to stare, and Abigail suddenly became conscious of her appearance. Her dress was torn and filthy, her hair a tangled mess, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She must look like a wild woman, nothing like the proper Boston lady she had once been. Xavier seemed to sense her discomfort. Don't worry about them, he said quietly. The people here know me. They'll understand once they hear what's happened. They dismounted in front of the courthouse, and Xavier led them inside to a spacious office where an elderly man with white hair and bushy eyebrows sat behind a large desk. Xavier, the man said, rising to his feet with a smile that quickly faded as he took in their bedraggled state. "What in God's name happened to you?" "It's a long story, Judge Harmon," Xavier replied, removing his hat. "But the short version is that we finally have what we need to bring down Harlan Wade." The judge's eyebrows shot up. "Indeed? Well, you'd better tell me everything." Over the next hour, Xavier related their journey, with Abigail and Peterson adding details where needed. Judge Harmon listened intently, asking occasional questions, but mostly allowing them to tell their story uninterrupted. When Xavier produced Curtis's ledger, the judge examined it with growing amazement. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "Names, dates, amounts paid for each. Murder." He looked up at them, his expression grave. "Wade has half the county officials in his pocket, including the territorial marshal in Tucson. But with this evidence, and your testimonies, I believe we can finally bring him to justice." "What happens now?" Abigail asked. "I'll wire the governor immediately," Judge Harmon replied. "In the meantime, you three need protection. Wade will know by now that you've escaped with evidence against him." "My deputy Carter is reliable," Xavier said. "He can help keep watch." "Good." The judge turned to Abigail. "Miss Jennings, I'm deeply sorry for what happened to your father. Rest assured, his death will not go unpunished." Abigail nodded, grateful for his compassion. "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Harmon arranged rooms for them at the Silver Ridge Hotel, insisting that they get cleaned up and rest while he set the legal machinery in motion. As they left the courthouse, Xavier placed a gentle hand on Abigail's shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. "Your father would be proud." "We did it," Abigail corrected him. "I couldn't have made it without you, Xavier." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Judge Harmon sent telegrams to the territorial governor and to federal marshals he trusted. Depositions were taken from all three of them, particularly focusing on Curtis's final confession and the contents of his ledger. Xavier's deputy, a serious young man named Carter, stood guard outside their hotel rooms, ensuring their safety while the legal process unfolded. For Abigail, it was a strange limbo, the danger not fully past, but for the first time in weeks, she could sleep without fear of being found by Wade's men. She was given new clothes by the judge's wife, a kind woman who fussed over her like a mother hen, insisting that she eat proper meals and rest. On the third evening, Xavier knocked on her hotel room door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see him dressed in clean clothes, his hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed. "Would you care to join me for dinner?" he asked, a hint of nervousness in his usually confident demeanor. "Downstairs in the hotel dining room. Judge Harmon says it's safe enough, with Carter keeping watch." Abigail smiled. "I'd like that very much." The hotel dining room was modest but pleasant, with white tablecloths and a vase of wildflowers on each table. As they ate, Abigail found herself studying Xavier's face in the lamplight, noticing details she'd missed before: a small scar at the edge of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the single strand of silver in his otherwise dark hair. "Judge Harmon received a telegram from the governor today," Xavier said as they finished their meal. "Federal marshals arrested Wade this morning at his ranch. They found more evidence there: documents, letters that corroborate everything in Curtis's ledger." Abigail felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So it's really over?" "Not quite," Xavier cautioned. "There will be a trial, and you'll likely need to testify. But Wade's power is broken. His bought officials are scrambling to save themselves, turning on each other. The governor has already appointed a new territorial marshal." "What about my father's land?" "It's yours, legally and without question," Xavier assured her. "Judge Harmon has already filed the paperwork to ensure it stays that way. Once the trial is over, you can go back. Rebuild if that's what you want." Abigail considered this. The thought of returning to the homestead, with its burned buildings and the fresh grave of her father, filled her with both longing and dread. "I don't know if I can live there alone," she admitted, "but I don't want to sell it either." Xavier reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to decide right away," he said gently, "and you don't have to be alone." Abigail's heart quickened at his words, at the look in his eyes that spoke of possibilities she had scarcely dared to imagine. "What are you saying, Xavier?" He took a deep breath. "I'm saying that these past few days have shown me something I never expected to find. In you, Abigail Jennings, I've found a woman of extraordinary courage and intelligence, someone who faces danger without flinching, who sees the world with clear eyes but still believes in justice." He paused, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I know it's fast too fast by proper standards. We've only known each other a short while. But out here, life moves differently. We see the truth of a person when they're tested, and I've seen the truth of you." "And what truth is that?" Abigail asked softly. "That you're the kind of woman I could build a life with," Xavier replied simply. "If you'd be willing to consider it." Abigail felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. In the space of a few days, her world had been turned upside down, yet somehow, sitting across from this man who had saved her life and captured her heart, everything felt right. "I would be more than willing to consider it," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Xavier's face lit up with a smile so radiant it took her breath away. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her fingers. "Then perhaps, when this is all over, we might build something new together," he suggested. "On your father's land, if you wish, or somewhere else entirely. The territory is vast, full of possibilities." "I think my father would have liked that," Abigail said, smiling through her tears. "He always said the West was a place where people could reinvent themselves, where the past mattered less than what you chose to make of the future." 2 months later, Abigail stood on the porch of a newly constructed cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The homestead was coming back to life, the main house rebuilt, the fields replanted. Her father's grave properly marked with a stone bearing his name and the words, "Scholar, Pioneer, Beloved Father." The trial of Harlan Wade had ended with a conviction on multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and corruption. He would spend the rest of his life in a territorial prison. His empire had crumbled, the land returning to those from whom it had been stolen or passing to new settlers eager to make their own mark on the frontier. Peterson had settled nearby, using his knowledge of mining to develop a small silver claim in the foothills. He often joined them for Sunday dinners, regaling them with stories from his prospecting days. The sound of hoofbeats drew Abigail's attention. Xavier rode into the yard, returning from his duties in Silver Ridge. Though still a marshal, he had arranged to patrol this region, allowing him to combine his work with helping to restore the homestead. He dismounted, securing his horse before climbing the porch steps to join her. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close for a kiss that still made her heart race after all they had been through together. "How was town?" she asked when they finally parted. "Quiet, thankfully," Xavier replied. "Judge Harmon sends his regards. He's officially set the date for our wedding 3 weeks from Saturday, if that suits you." Abigail smiled, leaning into his embrace. "It suits me perfectly." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Abigail thought back to that moment when she had fallen to her knees in the dust, certain her life was about to end. Instead, it had been a beginning, the start of a journey that had brought her to this place, to this man, to a life fuller and more meaningful than she could have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About promises kept," Abigail replied, turning to face him. You told me I would never kneel again, and you were right. With you, I stand tall. Xavier smiled, touching his forehead to hers. And we'll keep standing, together, for all the days to come. As the night deepened around them, Abigail knew with certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them side by side, two souls forged in adversity, bound by love, building their own legend in the wild and beautiful land they both called home.